Okay, I'm going to keep this really brief because I said this, referenced this in the previous video on the layout of content. But regarding the neurocognitive domains table, um, I know it's a lengthy bit of content there. Um, the reason why is because this is critically important, in my opinion, and this table has validity and usefulness to you beyond just neurocognitive disorders, as I described in the text intro there. So that's why I think that that this can be really helpful to you just in your broader assessment skill building, as well as to neurocognitive disorders. So that's why all the detailed content for the neurocognitive domains table. Okay, so starting with complex attention. So let me come over here to the examples of assets column, and let's look at kind of the primary facets of complex attention. So the first one is sustained attention, the ability to focus on any particular thing over a period of time. If you recall, we had talked about this idea of how with young people, for example, meaning primary school age children, who often you hear a parent or teacher comment, well, uh, they can't seem to sustain attention for more than a few minutes in algebra class, but can sustain attention for seemingly endless period of time with a video game or something, or social media or something like we talked about, that's designed to have high recruitment of attention, if you recall that discussion. So anyway, one of the hallmarks of complex attention is the ability to sustain attention to anything, whether it's something work related, something desirable, something not desirable, the ability to pay attention in any circumstance. Selective attention is not when people, it doesn't mean, well, they only pay attention to me when they want to, but selective attention means really the ability to tune out other stimuli as you are paying attention to something. So the ability to for me to continue to lecture when someone's walking by in the hallway and or a group of people walk by and they're talking really loudly and making a lot of noise, the ability for me to continue to lecture to you guys. Well, sometimes I do get distracted, so that's kind of the point, right? The ability to continue to talk through a lecture while there's a lot of noise in the background, in a particular instance, is an example of selective attention. Okay, divided attention is the ability to attend to two tasks at the same time. Now, I will tell you that I've read a good bit about multitasking in the last couple of years, and this idea of whether we kind of, there's a lot of researchers who say the whole idea of divided attention, or certainly multitasking, is something we kind of delude ourselves about, meaning we believe that we're multitasking, but it's really not possible to multitask. Um, so anyway, that aside, the idea, an example of divided attention would be speaking on the phone, hopefully hands-free, while you're driving a car. So, and again, these are kind of dicey examples because they're different schools of thought about whether we can, just forget kind of legal and political stance, but just from a cognitive standpoint, are we actually able to truly um, perform fully in driving a car while we're carrying on a conversation, even if it's hands-free on a phone, or even with a person in the passenger seat next to us. Either way, that's an example of divided attention. All right. So when we apply this basic definition to what it looks like in mild or major decline, you can see here, and one of the things I did this semester before as I was updating the slides, is I went and highlighted this myself to kind of pull out the key words, because the whole table is really important. So I tried to kind of drill down and just kind of pull out the highlights. But anyway, so examples of mild decline in top complex attention. Normal tasks take longer, needs more double checking. Persons double checking themselves, not necessarily someone looking after them, but that can be part of it easier. And a person will struggle more with, let's say, carrying on a conversation with you while the television is on, even if it's kind of on in the background. In major decline, there is that was Kira, by the way. In major decline, performing mental calculations. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean arithmetic. That can be, what do we need from the store? Right? Looking in the refrigerator and assessing what you need in the store, from the grocery store, by what you see. Anyway, difficulty holding new information, and difficulty in environments with multiple stimuli, and being able to kind of, if there's too much stimuli and when complex attention is hit in a major way, major using the words of the DSM, a person can really have trouble functioning on any particular cognitive task in an environment with multiple distractions. Okay, next up is executive function, and there are a number of kind of basic pillars that make up executive functioning. The first one is planning, the ability to interpret or sequence a picture or object arrangement. For me, the best example, the thing that always comes to mind when I think of an example of planning, is the ability to follow directions, particularly picture-based directions. So if you, and maybe have, if you recall from your own childhood, or if you've had young children, you've likely encountered Legos. One of the things I remember very clearly from when my kids were younger children, that they were, for a period of time, very into Lego sets, and we would get Lego sets for Christmas or birthday, and often their grandparents would buy them these somewhat elaborate Lego sets, Star Wars ships and stuff like that. So, of course, they open it, look at the box, they're really excited, and then hand it to me to put together. So, so one of the very first things you do if you're putting a Lego thing together, at least the way I always did it, was you open up the directions and you kind of sort out all the different sizes and shapes to the Legos. Try to organize your big glop of Legos into a more manageable pile. So that's a good example of planning. In terms of sorting things out and following a guide, particularly a picture-based guide, over a sequence of steps. And sequencing is a big part of executive functioning in general. The ability to think in steps to accomplish an end is a kind of a hallmark of executive functioning. The next one here, decision making. So deciding in the face of performing a task, deciding in the face of competing alternatives. So so this can be sorry, I was just noticing how long it was running. The last one was running, so I'm picking up here on decision making, and I try to the rest of this voice thread will not be as detailed and with as many audio clips as this one. This just is really important. I usually take a good part of a session to walk you guys through this neurocognitive domains table. So anyway, Decision making, performing tasks, assess, process of deciding the face of competing alternatives. So they use the example of gambling and like playing poker, and you have a set of cards on the table, and you have to decide what cards you want to keep based on what on the table, and there's multiple different options. I find the simplest example is one I've used in other contexts before with you guys, which is just think of a quarterback. Think of Lamar. What does he do when he gets the ball? He does a lot of things before he gets the ball in terms of reading the defense and making sure the guys on his team are lined up correctly. But once the ball is hiked, what he's doing in very short fashion is he's reading the field. He's reading the defense. He's reading where his receivers are. He's making mental note of where his blockers are, his running backs are, and even though he has a play in mind, and that's going to go where the ball is going to go to a person that's kind of mostly predetermined. It's not absolute because the play may kind of show that, as Lamar will say, taking what the defense gives you, you may end up needing to go with a different option. So the process of looking at his receivers and his running backs, kind of knowing where they are on the field, where they are in relation to the defensive person who's assigned to them, is a good example, maybe a simple example, at least to me, of decision making. Having multiple options and needing to the task, cognitive task of making a decision based on multiple options, or in even competing options. So working memory, a good example of working memory. Sorry, here, the ability to hold information for a brief period and manipulate it. Let's say a good example of this might be a child learning his or her timetables, right? The multiplication tables. So the ability to hold on to 3 times 4 equals 12, and then flip it around, 4 times 3 is 12, or 3 times 4 is 12, or to hold it in a way that one can say, well, 12 divided by 4 is 3, for instance. So the ability to hold these numbers and hold formula concepts in your head and then manipulate them is an example of working memory. So the next one under executive function is feedback error utilization. The ability to benefit from feedback to infer rules for solving a problem. Simplest example is this is think about purchasing something online. And especially if you're maybe purchasing something from a website that you don't normally use, where you have to fill all the fields in, or an application. Let's say you're filling out an application and you go to save and submit, and you get an error message saying different data points are missing. Maybe your zip code was incomplete, something like that. The ability to take that feedback, go and fill in or fix the fields that were incorrect, so you complete that application or that purchase. You fix, you resave, resubmit. Now it works. That's feedback error utilization as a executive function and cognition. Okay, so the next one under executive functioning is overriding habits or inhibition. So perhaps think of a instance where maybe you've driven to a friend's house, a number of times, but you don't go there every day. So you don't drive to that friend's house often enough where you might remember the way to get there, but you're not 100% sure, and it's just as easy to put Google Maps on or Waze or something else. And so you put your GPS map on, because it's just, then you know you're going the wrong way, and you get most of the way there, and you realize that for whatever reason GPS isn't working, your connection is cutting in and out, but clearly the map is not taking you to your friend's house, or maybe it's taking you one block off. And so an example of overriding habits or inhibition would be to say, okay, I can figure this out by sight. And you just turn your map off because it's clearly not going to take you in the right direction. You may need more focus. In other words, maybe you're listening to music and you're kind of glancing at your GPS or listening to it instruct you, and you're paying less focused attention on it. You turn the GPS off. You find your friend's house from memory with a little more focus. That's overriding habits or inhibition under executive functioning. Okay, the last one under executive functioning is mental and cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between two concepts, task, or response rules. The easiest one I can think of, kind of the most simple one, is if you've ever called anywhere, certainly if you've ever called your insurance company, this is an example I think of, you may have the option to input information verbally or type it into your phone. So one of the things I find is if I'm calling an insurance company as a provider and they ask for all this information, sometimes I start to type it into my phone and it doesn't take. And so, well, please enter, you get the same audio prompt over and over again. So switching to say, okay, well, then I'll just speak it into the phone instead of typing it. And that works. And then you move on to the phone tree where you can begin your half-hour hold to talk to somebody. But switching from typing the data into the phone to speaking the data into the phone is a simple example of mental cognitive flexibility, the last facet of under the cognitive domain of executive functioning. So last thing before we move on to executive functioning, what does decline look like? In its more mild form, one may find social gatherings more taxing and less enjoyable. The ability to focus. If you are struggling with executive functioning, you may find the ability to focus on a conversation when there's lots of human voices in the background and maybe very close to you. Not only can that be more challenging, but just flat out unpleasant. Fatiguing from that kind of effort, an increased difficulty in multitasking, or kind of, well, being able to talk on the phone and type at the same time. Suddenly, we can all kind of sort of do it. I don't know that we can any of us really do it that well, but we can kind of sort of do it. But the ability to do it at all begins to diminish. Even picking up a task that you have an interruption, thinking about if I'm lecturing and a group of students or faculty or whoever walk by and they're making a lot of noise and I'm distracted for a moment, in executive and kind of mild interruption or decline in neurocognitive functioning, it's hard to come back to the task that you were on. So people may appear to kind of pause and have a distraction and then really kind of struggle to come back to what they were previously focused on. When executive functioning really gets hit, things like even getting dressed, preparing a meal for yourself, anything that requires sequence of tasks becomes really hard, and to the point where an advanced neurocognitive decline, they eventually need one very focused thing. In other words, the ability to kind of listen to the news while you're getting dressed becomes diminished. You have to do one or the other, and eventually you need help with getting dressed even without the distractions. Okay, so you may find learning and memory a little more self-explanatory than executive functioning. So let me walk you through the examples of assessments box here. So in the context of domains of cognition or cognitive domains, under the cognitive domain of learning and memory, the DSM authors define memory in two specific ways. One is called immediate memory span. That is simply the ability to repeat something back immediately after. You get um, you get verbal or visual input, and you can, or other input, and you can reproduce it in some way. You can speak it, draw it, point to it. You can you can acknowledge it back in an immediate sense. Recent memory is kind of more kind of memory as we, kind of a daily memory as we think about it. The authors break down recent memory into three different primary processes of encoding new information, which means just retaining it in a short period of time. So free recall, for instance, and let's take the example of the video that we watched or hopefully you watched at the beginning. All right. So an example of free recall would be, without re-showing you the video or any pictures of the video, just say, tell me whatever you remember about that video. What was going on? What was the context? Who were the peoples? What were their roles? Anything you can recall about that video without rewatching it or looking at still images of it, anything of that, or hearing it, or hitting sound bites from it. Okay, cued recall would be is if you had pictures or still images, or even short video excerpts, or short sound bites from it, to say, well, uh, what was the woman doing in the car, right? I'll show you a picture of the car. Where was she going? All right, that's a cued recall. Recognition memory would be to say, um, was there a woman driving a car at the beginning of the video? Okay, something you could specifically point to. Okay, uh, did the mom have an appointment to attend to with her daughter? Things like that. Okay, so that's kind of that's the, just at a high level, the how you conceptualize free recall, cued recall, and recognition memory, which is how DSM defines encoding new information as recent memory. So some other aspects of memory include semantic memory, which is just semantic memory is very much like what you would see on Jeopardy. Okay, just recalling facts, data points from memory. Autobiographical memory, recalling personal events, or recalling people in your life, what they look like, how they behaved. Um, procedural. Uh, Procedural memory can be getting dressed or following directions to build a Lego set. And learning is unconscious learning of new skills. Learning algebraic formulas to input into algebra problems. So learning those basic functions, and retaining them, and then applying them to an algebra problem, can be an example of unconscious learning of skills. It can also be, if you ever either experience yourself interacting with a social media site, or watching a younger person interact with a video game, or get on a video game yourself, and you don't read anything about the directions, you kind of just feel it out, and you kind of through very quick trial and error, learn how to manipulate the app or the game. That's also unconscious learning. Okay, so some aspects of what happens in when one experiences or observes neurocognitive decline in the domain of learning and memory. Keeping track of things, often keeping track of bills. Sometimes, sadly, what happens with folks who have a condition like Alzheimer's that's onsetting, and they're kind of almost desperately trying to hide their symptoms from everybody, maybe even to a certain extent from themselves, can end up getting the power turned off, for instance, or the water turned off. Not because they don't have the money, but they just are not able to recall or track or keep a reminder for themselves of when to pay the bill and if they have paid the bill. Certainly, one of the things that can be an early sign of concern is when person is repeating themselves and not realizing that they're repeating themselves, and difficulty recalling events, particularly when we talk, and that can be in the form of hey, that person used to be so good at Jeopardy. They'd watch it and they'd always had 9 times out of 10 they'd have the answer before the contestants buzzed in, right? And I noticed them watching Jeopardy the other day, and they barely said a word. That's an example. Okay, they're not saying a word because they're not able to recall the data points anymore, or at least as quickly as they used to be able to. So difficulty recalling events can also be autobiographical or implicit or learning. But so a lot of times the way they begin to first manifest themselves is the inability to recall data points and or the inability to recall past events. And a lot of times these kind of surface to other people's attention when they're major events. Can't remember a wedding, can't remember the birth of their child, things like that. When it gets worse, folks tend to need frequent reminders to do any task, including basic activities of daily activities of living or activities of daily living. Have trouble keeping track of even a short list of items, and will tend to repeat themselves both in the context of stories from a distant time or even repeating themselves. Hey, did you go to the grocery store today? Yes, I did. 5 minutes later, hey, did you go to the grocery store today? Kind of thing. So learning and memory. All right, next up is language. And for the purposes of the DSM, our authors created or identified, they didn't really create these categories, but highlighted 3 primary categories of language. All right, so expressive language has a couple different components to it. Confrontational naming, which ironically sounds a little bit like a misnomer, but it's simply the cognitive task of identifying an object, either the physical object itself or an image of that object. So like a stoplight or traffic light. You can be out on the street, point to a traffic light and see it. We could come into class and I could show you a picture of a traffic light or stoplight. What is this? It's a traffic light or stoplight. Confrontational naming. Fluency is, in this context, is kind of being able to identify multiple items within a category. So, the ability to say a giraffe, an elephant, a rhino, and a hippo are all animals, or name me 4 animals, or we do it in the reverse. Those 4 things are what? Animals. And phonomic is the ability to identify a list of words starting with the same letter. So kind of understanding the cognitive task of, oh, these letters, these words all begin with the same letter, and I can name words with the same letter. By the way, I thought it was kind of funny. I'm convinced that somebody slipped that in as a word starting with that, but why they picked that letter, I can only imagine that somebody was having a little bit of fun and that got past everybody. Anyway, so that's phonomic. Under grammar and syntax is basically using the correct word to identify something. Sometimes you might be watching some of your national leaders talking, and you're like, that word doesn't mean that. He or she, I don't think that's what they meant, right? So, like that. Receptive language includes comprehension and verbal command. Okay, and yeah, so expressive, grammar, syntax, receptive language, which includes comprehension of a word, comprehension of definitions associated with words or objects, and being able to respond appropriately to a verbal command. So some indications of mild or early language or neurocognitive decline in the domain of language include people may pause more because they're struggling to find the word that they want to use in the context of what they're speaking of. And a lot of times, what you'll notice with folks is they'll use more general terms. Um, hey, did you know the woman over there got a new tree in her yard? You mean your neighbor Judy? Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's it, the woman, right? Um, or did you see what the orange guy did today? Well, who's that? Okay, like that. So and avoid the use of specific names. Um, and again, you'll notice both kind of speaking grammatical errors and using words that clearly don't mean what they're conveying what they intend to convey. Okay, and you might hear phrases you know what I mean, or that thing, or you know what I'm talking about. Some of those phrases will tend to crop up more and more in someone's speech. More pronouns, more pauses, more, well, you draw your own conclusion. You know what I mean. Okay, last two from our cognitive domain table. All right, so second to last here is perceptual motor abilities. And the authors define these in visual perception, visual constructual, perceptual motor, praxis, and gnosis. All right, and I'm going to walk you through each one separately. Okay, visual perception is very simply correctly identifying an object or an organism, including human being, facial recognition. So being able to identify a face associated with a particular person, to see, like I said, a traffic light and identify as a traffic light. Also, matching of figures. So particularly matching of interlocking figures. So a visual task of this would be fitting a phone charger into a phone. So in other words, um, being able to see that an Apple charger doesn't fit into a Galaxy phone. Now you can do that tactile too, kind of push it in there, it won't fit, it won't charge. But to be the ability to look at the kind of uh, the opening where the charger goes in the phone and to see the shape of the Apple charger and know those two are incompatible is an example of visual perception. Visual constructional is simply the ability to uh, manipulate your hands or but potentially other parts of your body, but to assemble things with your hand, at least in part by sight. So uh, following, the ability to read directions and follow them can be in building a Lego set could be an executive function, but but working your hands visually, seeing snapping Legos into the correct place with your hands because you see what's you know where how they need to fit together based on the directions is also visual constructual. Likewise, the example of plugging the charger into the phone is a visual constructual exercise. So perceptual is kind of ties into visual constructional. So let's take the example of plugging your charger into your phone. The hand-eye coordination that's involved in holding your charger in one hand and your phone in the other, and bringing them towards one another. Perceptual motor is the act of plugging it in. That involves hand-eye coordination, but the using your hands and your vision to successfully complete the task of getting your phone charged, or plug and charger in so that your phone at some later point is charged, it's a perceptual motor task. Now, one of the things that they don't call out specifically in the DSM that I wanted to draw to your attention here is that all of these perceptual motor abilities, but particularly when we talk about visual perception, perceptual motor, these are key. These are key in driving. Okay, and I don't know why I'm writing driving up there. I just like to play with the digital pencil. But so one of the things that happens in terms of when we realize that a loved one is having a serious cognitive issue is, unfortunately, after they've had several uh, minor fender benders or car accidents. Sadly, sometimes it's a major car accident before people, kind of take notice. Um, but the erosion of the visual perception and perceptual motor, the most common one being the diminished ability to perceive. This is really hard to do without the visual, but to perceive that a car is in front of you at a certain distance, and they are going at a certain speed, which may include suddenly stopping and going to a zero speed, and how that affects the distance from you to them. And so that basic piece of cognition that's required to drive safely is one that often kind of is diminished early on in many forms of mild and major neurocognitive disorder, and hence ends up being a common symptom or warning sign, if you will. So praxis is really the ability to learn and retain gestures, like waving to someone, um, gesture to hail a cab, uh, to signal a waiter. These are all examples of praxis, and one of the things that is used as a kind of a test of how well this particular aspect of cognition is working is just to simply ask someone to show you, well, how would you use that? How would you, to use their words, pantomime? So the art of pantomime is actually a really the best way to to demonstrate that cognitive ability. And then gnosis, I'll just go on the next one here. Gnosis is the ability to recognize faces and colors, and what colors mean. So recognition of a face, not just the face of a person, oh, well, that's so and so, but also to recognize facial expressions, and this is part of social cognition too. Um, which is, you see it right below there. But gnosis is the recognition of faces, the recognition of colors to mean certain things. A traffic light is a great example of that. Green means go, red means stop, yellow means slow down. Those are examples of gnosis. So our last one is social cognition, and the authors break it down into two primary constructs or cognitive phenomenon that fall under kind of how they primarily define social cognition. The first one, as we were just talking about before, with as a kind of related to gnosis, is the ability to recognize emotions on faces, and frankly even just general body language in terms of how someone is feeling. Um, it doesn't, um, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with their interest or lack of interest. It's the inability to see uh, upset, sadness on a person's face and be able to distinguish that from happiness or joy. Um, Theory of the mind is the ability or inability to consider another person's emotional state, and this is where people who are taking care of loved ones who have neurocognitive disorders, particularly if they're providing in-home care, this one particular can really just wear people down, because essentially what it does is it erodes the capacity for empathy. So in other words, this consideration of others which is part of empathy, right? But consideration of others is a facet of cognition. And so uh, absolutely there is a willingness of each individual to consider others. And certainly there are phenomenon like narcissistic personality disorder, where a person is either incapable or just flat out unwilling to consider um, the emotions of others, or another's mental state. But in theory of the mind, it really refers to the loss of the ability to do that. And that presents itself as an inability to empathize, while these other, so this can be particularly taxing because a loved one is requiring more and more assistance, but they seem less and less aware of the effect that's having on the person who's taking care of them. It's a common, at least in my, and that's not from the book, that's just from my own personal, my experience doing social work, that's come up. So anyway, um, that's uh, that's the theory of mind and the last of our domains of cognition.